The evening was supposed to be just another quiet night in Washington. D.C. Army General Marcus Reynolds had just stepped out of a downtown restaurant, still in uniform, his chest decorated with medals from decades of service. He had fought for his country, led troops into battle, and stood for the very ideals of justice and honor. But none of that mattered in the next few moments. As he walked toward his car, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hands where I can see them." The command came from an FBI agent, Agent Daniel Carter. His badge was clipped to his belt, his gun drawn and pointed straight at the general. Marcus froze, his instincts kicking in. He faced danger before, but this was different. This was his own country, his own soil. "What's the problem, Agent?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Carter didn't lower his weapon. Instead, his eyes were filled with something darker, contempt. "I don't take orders from people like you," he muttered. "People like you." The words hung heavy in the air. A small crowd began to gather, their phones coming out, recording everything. But Carter wasn't thinking about that. He was too blinded by his own prejudice to realize the mistake he was making. In his mind, Marcus wasn't a decorated general, a man who had given his life to serve his country. To him, Marcus was just another face, another target. But what Carter failed to see was that this was no ordinary man. This was someone with connections, someone who had the respect of the highest-ranking officials in the country. And most importantly, someone who knew his rights. Before things could escalate further, sirens wailed in the distance. Police cars swarmed in, red and blue lights flashing across the street. Officers rushed out, demanding Carter drop his weapon. But he hesitated, his pride and arrogance getting in the way. And that hesitation would cost him everything. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire justice system. A decorated general humiliated on the street, an FBI agent who thought he was above the law, and a country watching as justice unfolded in real time. But would Carter face the consequences of his actions, or would the system find a way to protect him? Stay tuned to find out. The air was thick with tension. The flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue across Agent Carter's face as he kept his gun trained on General Reynolds. His grip tightened, his knuckles turning white, but there was something else: hesitation. He knew the moment he lowered his weapon, everything would change. The police officers didn't wait. "Drop your weapon." "Now," one of them shouted, stepping forward cautiously. More officers arrived by the second, their hands on their holsters, ready to act. General Reynolds didn't flinch. He had spent his life under pressure, leading troops through chaos. But this moment was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet, he was being treated like a criminal. He kept his hands where they could be seen, but his eyes locked onto Carter's. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm but firm. Carter's mind raced. How had things escalated so quickly? He had stopped Reynolds based on a hunch. No, not a hunch. A bias he wouldn't dare say out loud. And now the tables had turned. The cameras were still rolling. The entire world was watching. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, Carter finally lowered his gun. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Officers rushed forward, taking the weapon from his hands, placing him in cuffs as bystanders murmured in shock. Some clapped. Others just stood frozen, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. As Carter was led toward a squad car, his face twisted in anger. "This is a mistake," he hissed. "I was just doing my job." A nearby officer shook his head. "That's not how we do things." But the real question lingered in the air. Why did he do it? Why had he singled out General Reynolds? The public was already piecing together the answer, and it wasn't looking good for the FBI. Meanwhile, Reynolds stood tall, his reputation intact, but his heart heavy. He had spent years defending the country, believing in its values, only to be treated like this. And he knew this wasn't just about him. This was bigger. This was about accountability, about a system that lets certain people operate without consequences. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Headlines were written. But would justice truly be served? Or would Carter's connections save him from facing the truth? One thing was certain. This wasn't over yet. The world was watching. Within hours, the video of Agent Carter pointing a gun at General Reynolds spread across social media like wildfire. News anchors dissected every second of the footage. Legal analysts debated the potential charges, and people across the country demanded answers. But behind the headlines, a much bigger battle was unfolding, one that wasn't just about one FBI agent or one general. It was about a system that had allowed something like this to happen in the first place. Inside the police station, Carter sat in an interrogation room, his jaw clenched. His badge had been taken, his gun confiscated, but his confidence, that was still intact. He had friends in high places. He had built a career on knowing how to navigate situations like this. He wasn't about to let one mistake take him down. Across the city, General Reynolds sat in a different kind of room, a quiet office inside a government building, surrounded by military officials who had served alongside him for years. They were furious. "This is unacceptable," one of them said, pacing the room. An FBI agent pulling a gun on a decorated general. What kind of message does this send? Reynolds remained silent, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of his chair. He wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about all the people who didn't have the connections he had, the ones who faced situations like this without cameras, without witnesses. How many of them had been silenced? How many had never seen justice? Meanwhile, the FBI was scrambling. The higher-ups knew this was a PR disaster, and the agency was under pressure to respond. They released a carefully worded statement about an ongoing internal review, but the public wasn't buying it. Protests had already begun outside their headquarters, signs demanding accountability. This wasn't just about one agent anymore. It was about trust in the system itself. Back at the station, Carter's lawyer arrived, a man well-versed in spinning narratives. "We can make this go away," he assured Carter. "There are ways to shift the blame. You were acting on instinct. You felt threatened. We just need to control the story." But Carter wasn't sure anymore. For the first time, he felt something creeping into his chest, doubt. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally gone too far. And out there in the streets, the world was waiting for an answer. Would justice be served? Or would the system protect its own once again? The pressure was mounting from every side. Protests outside the FBI headquarters had doubled overnight, and media outlets ran constant coverage of the case. Every angle of the footage was analyzed, every word Carter had spoken dissected. But the most damning evidence wasn't just the video. It was the history that was beginning to surface. Reports emerged about Carter's previous complaints, incidents that had been quietly buried. Whispers turned into public outrage. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern. Inside the FBI, agents were divided. Some defended Carter, arguing that he had simply misread the situation, that the stress of the job could make anyone react poorly. Others, however, weren't so sure. "This isn't just about him," one agent muttered in a hushed meeting. "This is about us. If we protect him, we're saying this behavior is okay." But were they willing to let one of their own fall to protect their image? Meanwhile, General Reynolds was running out of patience. He had given his statement, cooperated fully with the investigation, and waited for justice to take its course. But he had seen this before. Powerful people protecting their own, waiting for the outrage to die down. He wasn't about to let that happen. With quiet determination, he reached out to an old friend in the Justice Department. "I want this taken seriously," he said over the phone. "No cover-ups. No favors." As the case built momentum, Carter's lawyer worked tirelessly to control the narrative. He arranged an exclusive interview, hoping to turn public sympathy back in Carter's favor. Sitting stiffly in front of the camera, Carter rehearsed his lines. "I feared for my life," he would say. "I was just doing my job." But the world had already seen the video. His expression, his words, his hesitation, it was all there. And no matter how many times he tried to justify his actions, the truth was inescapable. Then, just as tensions seemed ready to explode, the Justice Department announced a shocking decision. Carter would be formally charged. The words hit like a thunderclap. No one had expected it to happen this fast. The FBI was in turmoil, protests turned into celebrations, and the country held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. But this wasn't the end, far from it. A trial was coming. The truth was about to be put under a microscope. And for the first time, Carter realized he might not be able to escape this one. But this wasn't the end, far from it. A trial was coming. The truth was about to be put under a microscope. And for the first time, Carter realized he might not be able to escape this one. As the world braced for the trial, something unexpected happened. Just when it seemed like justice was finally catching up with Carter, new evidence surfaced. Evidence that threatened to change everything. A leaked internal memo from the FBI hinted at something deeper. Something far more sinister than anyone had realized. The memo suggested that higher-ups in the agency had been aware of Carter's past misconduct for years, but had deliberately covered it up. If that was true, then Carter wasn't just one bad agent. He was a symptom of a much larger problem. The leak sent shockwaves through Washington. Reporters scrambled to confirm the memo's authenticity, while inside the FBI, panic set in. Agents were called into closed-door meetings. Emails were deleted. Phones rang off the hook. Damage control had begun, but it was too late. The public had already seen the truth. This wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about an entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. General Reynolds, watching the chaos unfold, felt something he hadn't before hoped. Maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. But that hope was short-lived. Late one evening, his phone rang. It was a government contact, someone he had known for years. "You need to be careful," the voice on the other end warned. "This goes higher than you think. There are people who don't want this case to go to trial." Reynolds sat in silence, gripping the phone. He had faced enemies before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle fought with weapons on foreign soil. This was a war in the shadows, where power and influence dictated the rules. He had no intention of backing down, but now he understood. There were forces working against him, and they would do whatever it took to protect their own. At the same time, Carter was beginning to realize he was no longer the one being protected. The people who had once shielded him were now distancing themselves. Whispers of a plea deal started circulating, the kind that would make him take the fall while the real power players walked away untouched. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now he wasn't so sure. As the trial date approached, the stakes had never been higher. What had started as one man's reckless actions had spiraled into a scandal that could shake the entire justice system. The question now wasn't just whether Carter would go to jail, but who else might go down with him. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal analysts, and government officials filled every seat, their eyes locked on the man at the defense table, Agent Daniel Carter. He sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his once unshakable confidence now replaced with quiet desperation. He had been abandoned. The same system that once protected him had turned its back. His lawyer had pushed for a deal, but the prosecution wasn't budging. Too much was at stake. The trial had to happen. General Reynolds entered the courtroom, his presence commanding respect. He had been called to testify, not just as a victim, but as a witness to something much bigger than himself. The leaked memo had exposed corruption at the highest levels. And now, under oath, Reynolds spoke the truth, not just about the night Carter pulled the gun on him, but about the years of misconduct that had been ignored, the culture of silence that had allowed it to continue. His words were powerful, cutting through every excuse the defense had tried to build. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. Carter's history of misconduct, the FBI's internal attempts to bury complaints, and the undeniable proof that he had targeted Reynolds not out of duty, but out of bias. The jury sat stone-faced as witness after witness testified. The video footage played again, this time in slow motion. Every movement, every word, every second of hesitation was scrutinized. Then came the final twist. Just as it seemed the trial would be a clean-cut case of justice finally being served, an unexpected revelation shook the courtroom. A former high-ranking FBI official, previously silent, came forward with a statement. Carter, he claimed, had been following an order that night, an unofficial directive passed down from higher up. He wasn't acting alone, the man admitted. There were others who wanted General Reynolds taken down. Gasps rippled through the room. The case was no longer just about one agent's reckless decision. It was about a targeted attempt to undermine a decorated general, someone who had unknowingly stepped into a much bigger game of politics and power. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The FBI wasn't just on trial for one man's actions. The entire system was under a microscope. Carter, realizing he had been used, finally broke. In a desperate move, he agreed to testify against his former superiors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. Carter would serve time, but more importantly, his testimony would lead to investigations far beyond this case. The web of corruption was unraveling, and the people who thought they were untouchable were now in the crosshairs. As Reynolds stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different. He had won, but the fight wasn't over. Justice had been served today, but the battle for accountability was just beginning. As General Reynolds stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, he took a deep breath. The trial was over, but the weight of everything that had happened still sat heavy on his shoulders. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but he never imagined he would have to fight for it here, against people who were supposed to uphold the law. The media swarmed him with questions, but he didn't stop to answer. This wasn't about headlines or cameras. It was about something much bigger. Inside the courthouse, Carter sat in silence, staring at the floor. The man who once believed he was untouchable was now just another inmate waiting to be processed. But for the first time, he understood. He had been nothing more than a pawn. The people who had given him orders, who had protected him for years, had disappeared the moment he became a liability. And now he was the one paying the price. His deal with the prosecution meant he wouldn't spend his life behind bars. But his career, his reputation, everything he had built, it was gone. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. The FBI was forced to answer for its failures, and several top officials resigned before they could be investigated. A congressional hearing was announced to dig deeper into the corruption that had been exposed. People demanded change, and for once, it felt like real accountability was within reach. But Reynolds knew better than to celebrate too soon. Change didn't come easily. It had to be fought for. Weeks later, Reynolds sat alone in his office, staring at the medals on his shelf. They were supposed to represent honor, sacrifice, and duty. But now they reminded him of something else, the responsibility to keep fighting, even when the battle seemed impossible. He had won this fight, but how many others had been lost before him? How many people had been silenced? As he looked out the window, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just his story. It was a story about power, about justice, about the kind of country people wanted to live in. And while this chapter had come to an end, the fight for truth would never be over. With that thought, he stood up, adjusted his uniform, and walked out the door, ready for whatever came next.